My name is Audrey, 30 years old, and somehow still processing the sheer audacity of the family I almost married into. On my wedding day, I found the main table replaced. 12 seats taken entirely by my husband's family, while my parents were left standing. His mother sneered that they looked poor. He agreed, so I made an announcement that ruined him instantly. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to entitled people who severely underestimated your worth. Growing up in a small farming community in Iowa meant I understood the value of hard work before I even knew how to multiply fractions. My parents, Henry and Martha, spent their entire lives waking up before dawn, working the soil and sacrificing everything they had so I could have a better life. They were the most honest, hard-working people I knew. Their hands were calloused, their clothes were practical, and their love was unconditional. That upbringing gave me a spine of absolute steel. It was that exact Midwestern grit that allowed me to move to New York, survive the brutal meat grinder of Wall Street, and become a highly successful hedge fund manager by the time I was 28. I managed billions of dollars in assets. I negotiated hostile takeovers. I thrived in high-pressure environments where weak people crumbled. But nothing in my professional career could have ever prepared me for the sheer, staggering disrespect I faced inside the grand ballroom of my own wedding reception. The venue was nothing short of breathtaking. We were at a 5-star coastal resort, a property famous for its exclusive clientele, private beaches, and flawless architecture. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooked the crashing waves of the Atlantic Ocean. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded from crystal chandeliers hanging above the dance floor. The tables were draped in custom silk linens, set with gold-rimmed chargers, and the finest crystal glassware. It was a visual masterpiece, a celebration of luxury that was supposed to represent the happiest day of my life. I had just finished taking my solo bridal portraits out on the terrace. The ocean breeze was cool against my face, and I felt a brief moment of pure, unadulterated joy. I adjusted the train of my custom designer gown, took a deep breath, and walked through the grand double doors into the reception hall to join my new husband and our families before the rest of the 200 guests were allowed inside. I expected to see a beautiful blending of two families. I expected to walk up to the main VIP table, beautifully positioned at the center of the room, and see my beloved parents sitting right next to the family of the man I loved. Instead, the sight that greeted me made my blood run instantly cold. The main table was massive, designed to seat exactly 12 people. It was entirely occupied, but my parents were not sitting there. Sitting at the center, exactly where the bride and groom were meant to be flanked by their parents, was my mother-in-law, Eleanor. She was holding a flute of vintage champagne, laughing loudly with her sister. Next to her sat my husband, Blake, looking incredibly pleased with himself. The rest of the seats were filled with Blake's extended relatives. Aunts, uncles, and cousins I had barely spoken 2 words to during our entire engagement. They had completely taken over the VIP section, spreading their designer bags across the table, acting like royalty holding court. I stopped in my tracks, my eyes frantically scanning the massive ballroom for Henry and Martha. It took me an agonizing moment to find them. My heart shattered into a million pieces when I finally spotted them. My parents were standing in the far back corner of the room, right next to the swinging wooden doors that led to the catering kitchen. Waiters holding heavy trays of appetizers were constantly pushing past them, forcing my parents to awkwardly step aside and apologize over and over again. My father was wearing his rented tuxedo. It was a little too loose in the shoulders, and I knew he had been so proud to put it on this morning. My mother was wearing a lovely, modest navy blue dress she had saved up for months to buy. They were holding their generic paper table assignment cards, looking completely lost, humiliated, and entirely out of place. They were hovering near a small overflow table tucked behind a massive pillar, a table that did not even have a clear view of the stage or the dance floor. I felt a physical pain in my chest. The contrast was sickening. Blake's relatives, who had contributed absolutely nothing to our lives, were lounging in the seats of honor, while the people who had given me life and sacrificed everything for my success were shoved into a corner like unwanted staff. I did not scream. I did not cry. My Wall Street instincts kicked in immediately. I tightened my grip on my bridal bouquet until my knuckles turned stark white, and I marched straight toward the main table. The heavy silk of my dress swept across the marble floor, but I barely felt it. My eyes were locked entirely on Eleanor and Blake. As I approached, Eleanor noticed me. She did not look guilty. She did not look apologetic. She looked me up and down with that familiar, condescending sneer she always wore when dealing with anyone she deemed beneath her social status. Eleanor was a woman who was absolutely obsessed with the illusion of wealth. She constantly wore flashy logos, name-dropped imaginary celebrity friends, and treated service workers like garbage. "Audrey, darling." Eleanor called out, her voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "The room looks absolutely adequate. I am so glad my family could all sit together. It makes for such a powerful visual, do not you think?" I stopped right in front of her. "Where are my parents, Eleanor?" I asked, my voice dangerously low and steady. "Why are they standing by the kitchen doors while your distant cousins are sitting in their seats?" Eleanor let out a short, dismissive laugh. She took a slow sip of her champagne and waved her hand vaguely toward the back of the room. "Oh, please do not make a fuss, Audrey. I had the event planner move their seating cards. This table is highly visible. It is going to be in all the main photographs and video shots. Your parents are sweet people, I suppose, but let us be brutally honest. They look poor." I stared at her, genuinely unable to comprehend the level of venom coming out of her mouth. "They look poor." I repeated the words, tasting like ash. "Yes, they look poor," Eleanor said, completely unashamed. "Look at that cheap suit your father is wearing. It does not even fit him properly. And your mother's dress looks like it came from a discount rack at a suburban mall. They have that undeniable country vibe. If they sit up here with us, it will completely ruin the aesthetic of our family photos. I have important socialite friends arriving soon. I cannot have them thinking we are associating with farmers. They are much better off sitting in the back where they feel more comfortable among their own kind." I slowly turned my head to look at Blake, the man I had just exchanged vows with not 2 hours ago. The man who had promised to love, honor, and respect me and my family. He was swirling his drink, avoiding my gaze. "Blake," I said, my voice echoing with a chilling calmness. "Are you hearing what your mother is saying right now? Are you going to let her speak about my parents this way? Are you going to let her banish them to the kitchen doors at our own wedding?" Blake finally looked up at me. He looked annoyed. He let out a heavy sigh, acting like I was the one being unreasonable. "Audrey, come on. Do not start a dramatic scene on our wedding day. My mom has a valid point." He actually said that. He said she had a valid point. "Today is about us," Blake continued, leaning forward and lowering his voice. "My boss from the investment firm is going to be sitting at the table right next to this one. You know, I am up for a massive promotion next quarter. I need to project a certain image of generational wealth and sophistication. Your parents are great, but they are loud. They use the wrong forks, and they talk about corn yields and tractor repairs. Do not let your parents' country vibe embarrass me in front of my boss. Just let them stay in the back. It is not a big deal." "It is not a big deal." I looked past Blake and made eye contact with Audrey. Audrey was Blake's brother-in-law, married to Blake's toxic sister. He was a highly respected corporate lawyer, a brilliant black man who had always treated me with genuine kindness. Audrey was sitting at the edge of the table, and he looked absolutely disgusted by his own family. He shook his head slowly, his eyes flashing with quiet fury. He started to push his chair back, clearly, preparing to stand up and intervene to offer his seat to my parents. But I caught his eye and gave him a subtle, sharp shake of my head. I did not need anyone to rescue me. I was about to handle this myself. I turned my attention back to the lavish table setting. I looked at the imported orchids. I looked at the gold chargers. I looked at the vintage champagne Eleanor was happily gulping down. I looked at Blake's custom-tailored Italian tuxedo. And then the memories of the past year hit me like a freight train. I remembered the grueling, brutal reality of my life at the hedge fund. I remembered working 18-hour days staring at glowing monitors until my eyes burned analyzing complex market data, running financial models, and executing high-risk trades. I remembered the endless pressure, the sleepless nights, the relentless grind of surviving in a male-dominated industry that wanted to see me fail. I had worked myself to the absolute bone to earn my position. I had amassed significant personal wealth entirely on my own merit, driven by the work ethic my Iowa farmer parents had instilled in me. And I remembered the exact moment I wired $500,000 from my personal accounts to pay for every single aspect of this wedding. $500,000. That was the total cost of this magnificent event. I paid for the venue, I paid for the flowers, I paid for the vintage champagne Eleanor was currently drinking. I even paid for Blake's Italian tuxedo because he claimed his bonus was delayed. And while I was working myself to the point of exhaustion to fund this dream wedding, Blake was walking around his social circles loudly bragging to his family and friends that his wealthy parents were footing the entire bill. I had overheard him telling his uncle at the rehearsal dinner that the Blackwell family was sparing no expense to give me the wedding of my dreams. He had explicitly instructed me to keep my financial contributions quiet, claiming that revealing my wealth would emasculate him in front of his traditional family. Because I loved him, because I believed in protecting my partner's ego, I had foolishly agreed to play along. I let Eleanor parade around the venue, acting like the grand matriarch who had generously bankrolled the entire affair. But the irony of Eleanor's fake superiority was even deeper and far more delicious. As I stared at her smug, arrogant face, my mind flashed back to a highly confidential financial transaction I had executed exactly 3 days ago. Eleanor loved to project the image of old money, but the reality was that she was drowning in insurmountable debt. She had taken out multiple high-interest loans to fund her lavish lifestyle, her designer bags, and her luxury cars. She had mortgaged her sprawling suburban estate to the absolute limit. When her primary lender was preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings due to months of missed payments, the distressed debt portfolio crossed my desk at the hedge fund. I recognized the address immediately. Using a private LLC that could not be easily traced back to me, I quietly purchased the debt. I bought Eleanor's mortgage. I was literally the legal owner of her home. I held the power to evict her with a single signature. And here she was, sitting at a table I paid for drinking wine I bought, calling my hardworking parents poor. The audacity was so astronomical, it actually transcended anger. It moved past fury and settled into a state of absolute icy clarity. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was for victims, and I was nobody's victim. The grief of realizing my marriage was a scam evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating mindset of a Wall Street predator. I turned away from the table. I walked across the ballroom, navigating the crowded floor, until I reached the back corner near the kitchen doors. My parents looked up at me, their faces a mixture of profound embarrassment and heartbreaking love. "Audrey, honey?" My father said, his voice thick with emotion. He tried to force a smile, but his eyes were shining with unshed tears. "It is okay. You look beautiful. Do not worry about us. We can just stand right here. We can see you perfectly fine. We do not want to cause any trouble on your big day." My mother reached out and gently touched my arm. "Your dress is gorgeous, sweetie. Just go back to your husband. Enjoy your party. We are just so proud to be here." They were willing to be humiliated, willing to be shoved into a corner like garbage, just to ensure my happiness. That pure, selfless love broke my heart and simultaneously fueled the inferno of my resolve. I reached out and gently placed my heavy bridal bouquet into my mother's trembling hands. "I need you to hold this for a minute, Mom," I said softly. I gave my father a reassuring squeeze on his shoulder. "Do not move. I am going to fix this." I turned around. I locked my eyes on the main stage where the wedding band was setting up their instruments, playing soft jazz to welcome the arriving guests. I gave Blake one final dead-cold smile from across the room. He looked confused, his brow furrowing as he tried to read my expression. He had no idea what was about to happen. He thought he had married a quiet, compliant girl who would quietly swallow disrespect to keep the peace. He forgot that he had married a woman who dismantled hostile corporations for a living. I marched straight toward the stage. My heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, a rhythmic sound that cut through the ambient noise of the room. Every step I took was deliberate. Every step shed another layer of the illusion I had been living in. I walked up the side stairs of the stage. The master of ceremonies, a cheerful man in a bright suit, was holding the microphone, preparing to make the grand announcement welcoming the bride and groom. I stepped right into his personal space. Without saying a word, I reached out and ripped the microphone straight from his hand. He gasped, stepping back in shock. I turned to the band leader. "Cut the music," I commanded. My voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute authority of a direct order. The band leader hesitated for a fraction of a second before signaling the musicians. The soft jazz ground to an abrupt, jarring halt. The sudden silence in the massive ballroom was deafening. 200 guests stopped talking. Glasses halted mid-air. Waiters froze in their tracks. Every single face in the room turned toward the stage, their eyes locked entirely on the bride standing alone in front of the microphone. I tapped the head of the microphone twice. The sharp, amplified thud echoed off the crystal chandeliers and bounced against the glass windows. "Can everyone hear me clearly?" I spoke into the mic, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear, icy precision. "Excellent. Please, everyone take your seats. I have a very special announcement to make." I looked directly at the main table. I looked at Eleanor, whose smug smile was beginning to falter. I looked at Blake, who was suddenly gripping the edge of the table, a look of rising panic spreading across his face. They thought they could push my family into the shadows. They thought they could control the narrative. They thought they held all the power. They were about to find out exactly who was holding the reins. Before I could utter a single syllable into the microphone, the heavy scrape of a wooden chair against marble echoed across the silent ballroom. Audrey stood up. At 6'3", with the broad shoulders of a former college athlete and the razor-sharp mind of a top-tier corporate litigator, my brother-in-law commanded immediate attention. He was a proud African-American man who had fought tooth and nail through Harvard Law to earn his place in the world. He despised unearned arrogance, and he possessed a profound respect for genuine hard work. Throughout my engagement to Blake, Audrey was the only member of that family who treated me with actual dignity. Now he was looking at his mother-in-law with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. He did not ask for permission. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, stepped away from the lavish main table, and walked with deliberate, heavy strides straight toward the kitchen doors where my parents were huddled. The entire room watched him. The whispers of 200 guests died down to an absolute hush. "Mr. and Mrs. Lawson," Audrey said, his deep voice carrying easily across the silent room. "Please come with me. Your seats are waiting at the front, exactly where they belong." My father looked up, his weathered face flushing with humility. "Oh no, Audrey. Please. We do not want to cause a scene. Audrey looks so beautiful up there. We are perfectly fine standing." "You are the parents of the bride," Audrey replied gently but firmly. He reached out and placed a reassuring hand on my father's shoulder. "You raised an incredible woman. You do not stand by the kitchen doors while strangers drink her champagne. Come with me." He gently guided my mother forward by her elbow. Eleanor snapped. The meticulously crafted facade of the gracious, wealthy matriarch shattered instantly. She slammed her crystal flute down on the table so hard the stem nearly snapped. "Audrey, what on earth do you think you are doing?" Eleanor shrieked. Her voice hit a shrill, panicked pitch that made several of my Wall Street colleagues wince. "Bring them back there immediately. We have a seating arrangement. We curated this table for a specific demographic." Audrey stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly turned around to face his mother-in-law, shielding my parents behind his broad frame. "A specific demographic," Eleanor. Audrey repeated, his tone dangerously calm. "Do you mean a demographic of people who actually work for a living? Because from where I am standing, Henry and Martha are the only people at that table who possess an ounce of actual integrity. Eleanor's face flushed a violent shade of crimson. How dare you speak to me that way in front of my guests? You might have married my daughter, but do not forget where you came from. You do not dictate the social order in my family. You are a guest at this table, just like they are. Know your place. The racial and class undertones dripping from her words were impossible to ignore. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Several of my hedge fund partners' executives who ruthlessly demanded respect in boardrooms narrowed their eyes at Eleanor. Caroline Blake's sister and Andre's wife leaped out of her chair. She grabbed Andre's arm, her face twisted in embarrassment. Andre, stop making a scene, she hissed. Mom is right. They ruin the aesthetic of the photos. Just sit down and stop playing the social justice warrior. You are embarrassing us. Andre looked down at his wife. He looked at the woman he had promised to spend his life with, and I saw the exact moment his heart broke and hardened all at once. The cracks in their marriage, which had likely been forming for years under the weight of her toxic family, split wide open for everyone to see. I thought you were different from them, Caroline, Andre said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow echoed perfectly. I thought you had a soul. I was wrong. Do not touch me. He pulled his arm out of her grasp with a sharp, definitive motion. Caroline stumbled back, her mouth falling open in shock. Blake finally decided to intervene. He could not stand the fact that his perfect image was disintegrating in front of his managing director, who was seated just 10 feet away. Blake marched around the table, pointing a shaking finger at Andre. Back off, Andre Blake commanded, trying to sound authoritative but coming off entirely desperate. You are ruining my wedding. My managing partner is watching us right now. I am up for a promotion. I need this day to look flawless. Tell her parents to go back to the overflow section so we can start the dinner service. Andre laughed. It was the cold, humorless sound. You are a pathetic excuse for a man, Blake. Your wife paid for this entire spectacle, and you are letting your mother treat her parents like stray dogs just to impress your boss. You do not deserve Audrey. Shut up, Blake yelled, his face sweating profusely. This is my family, my rules. I watched every single second of this interaction from the stage. I stood perfectly still, the microphone gripped tightly in my right hand. The sheer adrenaline coursing through my veins sharpened my senses to a razor edge. I could see the sweat beading on Blake's forehead. I could see the panic in Eleanor's eyes as she realized the wealthy guests were judging her. I could see Andre standing like a brick wall, entirely unbothered by their threats, fully prepared to burn their social standing to the ground. They were unraveling. The entire Blackwell family was imploding under the weight of their own arrogant delusions. They thought their fabricated status made them untouchable. They thought they could bully a black man who had earned his own power and silence an Iowa farm girl who controlled their financial destiny. I raised the microphone to my lips. The feedback produced a sharp, piercing whine that instantly silenced the remaining whispers in the room. Blake, I said. My voice boomed through the massive speakers vibrating against the crystal chandeliers. Blake froze. He slowly turned away from Andre and looked up at me. His eyes were wide, pleading silently for me to play the role of the submissive, embarrassed bride. He wanted me to smooth things over. He wanted me to save him. But I was not there to save him. I was there to bury him. But I was not there to save him. I was there to bury him. Just as I drew a breath to deliver my first verbal strike, a rapid, frantic vibration erupted against my left wrist. My custom platinum smartwatch, hidden discreetly beneath the French lace cuff of my bridal gown, triggered a level 1 security override. I had engineered that specific notification protocol for one extremely narrow scenario. It meant there was a massive unauthorized movement of capital occurring within my personal financial ecosystem. My executive assistant, Evan, was the only human being on the planet authorized to bypass my digital blackout settings on my wedding day. I kept my face perfectly neutral, lowering the microphone to my side for a fraction of a second. I rotated my wrist just enough to illuminate the tiny digital screen. The text message from Evan read clear as day. Urgent. Blake attempting to wire $200,000 from the joint marital account. Destination routing sequence matches a known offshore gambling syndicate. Bank security protocols engaged. Transfer pending your immediate biometric approval. $200,000, right now, in the exact middle of our wedding reception. My brain, rigorously trained to analyze global market crashes and hostile corporate takeovers, in mere milliseconds immediately began connecting the scattered data points with ruthless predatory efficiency. I already knew Eleanor was drowning in a catastrophic ocean of mortgage debt. I was the one who had bought the foreclosure rights to her suburban estate just 3 days ago. But traditional banks do not initiate aggressive foreclosure proceedings overnight. They restructure, they negotiate, they grant extensions, unless, of course, the debtor has entirely liquidated their liquid assets to feed a vastly different, much hungrier beast. Gambling. High-stakes underground gambling. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, followed instantly by absolute freezing clarity. Blake was not just an arrogant, image-obsessed narcissist who looked down on my hard-working Iowa parents. He was a desperate, calculating, pathetic thief. He had aggressively pushed for us to open that joint banking account last week. He had framed it as a beautiful romantic tradition. He had kissed my forehead, held my hands, and told me it represented the merging of our lives and our shared future. He insisted we each deposit a sizable amount to show mutual trust. Instead of a foundation for our marriage, it was his personal premeditated bailout fund. The sheer sociopathic's audacity of his timing was staggering. While I was outside taking bridal portraits in the ocean breeze while I was walking down the aisle, while he was standing 10 feet away from me, arguing with Audrey about social demographics, Blake had one hand shoved in his tuxedo pocket, tapping frantically on his banking app. He was actively trying to drain my hedge fund capital, while his entitled family occupied the VIP table, and my parents were banished to stand by the kitchen doors. I quickly tapped the screen of my smartwatch twice. Request denied. Lock account entirely. Within 2 seconds, Evan replied, account locked. All funds secured. IP address of the device attempting the transfer logged and saved for legal evidence. The final lingering shred of affection I held for the man standing across the room evaporated into the cold air conditioning of the ballroom. Any lingering hesitation about ruining his life publicly vanished. He wanted to play high-stakes financial games with a Wall Street hedge fund manager. He was about to learn exactly what happens when you bet against the house. I raised the microphone back to my lips. The ballroom was still frozen in an agonizing state of suspense. 200 high-net-worth individuals, managing directors, corporate lawyers, and wealthy socialites were staring at me, waiting for the bride to speak. Blake was staring at me, sweating profusely, completely unaware that his little digital heist had just hit an impenetrable brick wall. Blake, I said. My voice, projecting through the state-of-the-art sound system, was completely devoid of warmth. It was the exact, calculated tone I used in boardrooms when I was about to dismantle a rival corporation. You look incredibly nervous. Is it because of the seating arrangement? Or is it because your banking app just notified you that your wire transfer was declined? The remaining color completely drained from his face. He looked like he had been struck by a high-voltage current. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords failed him. Eleanor gasped, her hand jerking in surprise. She knocked over her replacement champagne flute, sending it crashing onto the marble floor. The sharp sound of shattering crystal echoed violently through the silent room. Yes. I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, my eyes locked onto his terrified face like a sniper scope. I received the security alert right here on my wrist. While your mother was busy calling my hard-working parents poor, and while you were busy trying to impress your managing partner with an illusion of wealth, you were secretly trying to siphon $200,000 out of our newly established joint account. The managing partner of Blake's investment firm, who was seated at the adjacent table, physically recoiled. He sat up straight, his eyes darting between me and his employee, calculating the immense liability Blake suddenly represented. Audrey, standing near my parents at the back of the room, crossed his massive arms over his chest. An expression of grim, validating satisfaction settled over his face. He knew his brother-in-law was a fraud, but this level of overt criminality was staggering even to him. You see everyone I addressed the crowd, projecting my voice clearly treating the beautiful ballroom exactly like a hostile shareholders meeting. My husband told me that opening a joint account before the wedding was a romantic gesture, a way to build trust. But he forgot exactly who he married. I manage billions of dollars in assets on Wall Street. I do not leave my personal capital unprotected. Every single dollar in that account has a biometric security lock on it. I stopped pacing and turned my full, devastating attention to Eleanor. She was now gripping the edge of the silk-covered table, her face a mask of absolute unadulterated horror. And the routing number for that transfer was fascinating, I said, leaning slightly into the microphone. It did not go to a high-yield savings account. It did not go to a mutual fund or an index fund. It was routed directly to an offshore account heavily associated with underground gambling syndicates. I let that piece of information hang in the air for a heavy, agonizing moment. The silence in the room was absolute. "Tell me, Eleanor," I demanded, my voice ringing with authority. "How bad are your debts? Did you tell your son to steal from his bride on their wedding day to pay off your bookies, or was that his own brilliant, desperate idea?" Blake finally found his voice. It cracked with panic. He took a clumsy step toward the stage, raising his hands in a frantic, pathetic, placating gesture. "Audrey, wait. You are misunderstanding the transaction. I was just moving funds for an investment, a surprise investment for our future. You are stressed from the planning. Please put the microphone down. Let us talk about this in private." "Private," I echoed, letting a sharp, humorless laugh escape my lips. "You wanted to be public when you flaunted your fake wealth to your relatives. You wanted to be public when you allowed your mother to humiliate the people who raised me. We are doing this publicly, Blake. You wanted to project an image of generational wealth and sophistication to your boss today. So let us give him the full, unfiltered financial disclosure." I took a deep breath, feeling the absolute power shift entirely into my hands. My parents, standing back there by the catering doors, are farmers from Iowa. They wake up at 4 in the morning every single day. They built their lives on honesty, sweat, and integrity. They do not wear designer labels, and they do not care about exclusive country club memberships. But they have zero debt. Their credit score is absolutely flawless. They own their land outright. They are richer in character and financial stability than anyone sitting at this VIP table. I pointed a finger directly at Eleanor. "Meanwhile, you are sitting there wearing a dress that costs more than my parents' harvest equipment, yet your bank accounts are bleeding dry. You look down on my family because they do not match your superficial aesthetic, but your entire life is built on a collapsing mountain of high-interest loans, unpaid credit cards, and a crippling gambling addiction that has driven your son to commit felony wire fraud on his wedding day." The guests were completely paralyzed. The corporate sharks in the room were analyzing the situation, practically smelling the blood in the water. Blake's career was effectively over. He had tried to embezzle funds from a Wall Street powerhouse in front of his own executive leadership team. He had underestimated my intelligence, my resources, and my total willingness to burn his reputation to the ground. I looked down at him, watching him tremble in the Italian tuxedo I had paid for. The financial stab was deep, but I was not finished twisting the blade. I looked down at the man I had almost tethered my entire life and financial portfolio to. Blake was shrinking. The arrogant posture he had carried all evening had completely collapsed. He looked like a cornered animal, darting his eyes around the room, desperately searching for a friendly face. He found none. The Wall Street elite do not tolerate weakness, and they absolutely despise a sloppy fraud. But I was not done. The wire transfer was the financial crime, but the true crime, the unforgivable offense that demanded absolute public execution, was how he had treated my parents. I adjusted my grip on the microphone. The cold metal grounded me. "Let us talk about this refined aesthetic you both value so highly," I said, my voice echoing off the marble pillars. "Let us talk about what Blake considers worthy of his presence. You see, everyone, my parents flew to New York for the very first time 6 months ago. They left their farm in Iowa during a critical harvest season. They lost money taking that trip, but they did it just to see the new penthouse I had purchased in Manhattan. They wanted to see the life their daughter had built. And because they are the most genuine, hardworking people on this earth, they did not arrive empty-handed. I pointed to my mother, who was still standing near the back, tears silently streaming down her face as Audrey stood protectively beside her. They brought a gift, I continued, making sure every syllable hit like a hammer. It was not a designer watch or a case of imported French wine. It was a large, heavy box crafted from reclaimed oak wood from the original barn my grandfather had built. Inside that box was a collection of homemade preserves my mother had spent weeks canning. Alongside it was a massive, intricate quilt she had stitched entirely by hand. That quilt represented hundreds of hours of labor. Every patch was a piece of fabric from our family history. My grandmother's wedding dress, my father's old flannel work shirts, the blanket I was wrapped in as a baby. It was a masterpiece of heritage and pure, unconditional love. I looked back at Blake. His eyes were darting frantically toward the exit doors. He knew exactly what story I was about to tell, and he knew there was no escaping it. They placed that box carefully on the kitchen island of our penthouse, I said. My father had tears in his eyes when he told Blake he hoped that quilt would keep our future children warm. Blake smiled. He shook my father's hand. He played the part of the gracious, humble son-in-law perfectly. He thanked them and told them it was the most beautiful gift he had ever received. But the second my parents left for the airport, the mask slipped. I paused, letting the silence stretch across the ballroom. The air was so thick it felt suffocating. 200 guests were leaning forward, completely captivated by the unraveling of the groom. I had stepped out to the home office to take a conference call with our European markets. I continued, my voice hardening into a blade of steel. When I returned to the kitchen an hour later, the oak box was gone. The preserves were gone. The quilt was gone. I asked Blake where he had put them, assuming he had stored them safely in the cedar closet. He did not even look up from his smartphone. He took a sip of his espresso and casually told me he had taken out the trash. A collective audible gasp rippled through the reception hall, the sound of pure shock. Even the most ruthless, ice-cold hedge fund managers in the room looked physically sickened by the revelation. People who trade millions of dollars over breakfast still understand the sacred value of a mother's handmade gift. I thought he was joking, I said, staring directly into Blake's terrified, sweating face. I ran out of our apartment, sprinted down the hall to the service elevator, and opened the trash chute room. And there it was. The handcrafted oak box was smashed to pieces at the bottom of a greasy dumpster bin. My mother's jars of preserves were shattered, the glass mixed with rotting food and coffee grounds. The heirloom quilt, the one containing pieces of my grandmother's wedding dress, was shoved into a black plastic garbage bag, stained with leaking trash bags and completely ruined. I gripped the microphone so hard my knuckles ached. When I confronted him, "Do you know what this sophisticated high-class man said to me?" I looked at the crowd, pointing a manicured finger directly at Blake. He told me that my parents' garbage dirtied his $1 million apartment. He said we could not have country trash sitting on Italian marble countertops. He told me that if his firm partners came over for drinks and saw a handmade quilt, they would think he was marrying a hillbilly. He demanded that our home reflect a pristine, wealthy Wall Street aesthetic. He told me to grow up and realize that in his world, image is everything. I let the words hang in the air. The sheer repulsive hypocrisy of it all was intoxicating to expose. He called my parents gift country trash. I shouted, my voice finally rising, echoing like a gunshot across the ballroom. He threw away irreplaceable family history because he was so desperately insecure about his own fabricated status. And the supreme agonizing irony is that I paid for that $1 million apartment. My name is on the deed. My money bought the Italian marble he was so desperate to protect. He was living rent-free in a penthouse funded by the very Iowa farm work he considered too dirty to look at. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and brutal. The whispers erupted into open vocal disgust. The wealthy elite of Wall Street began pointing fingers directly at Blake and Eleanor. These were powerful, self-made individuals who respected grit and hustle. What they absolutely reviled was a parasite who bit the hand that fed it, a pretender who lacked the basic decency of a human being. I watched Blake's managing director, a formidable man in his 60s, lean over and whisper something sharp to the human resources executive sitting beside him. The HR executive nodded curtly, pulling out his smartphone and typing rapidly. Blake's career was evaporating before his very eyes. The prestigious job, the networking, the elite status he craved more than oxygen, it was all burning to ashes on the marble floor of this resort. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. I saw wives of prominent CEOs shaking their heads in disgust. I saw my own colleagues, the brilliant, ruthless analysts I worked alongside every day, glaring at Blake with undisguised contempt. In our world, you might be ruthless in a negotiation, but you never disrespect someone's mother. Blake had broken the unwritten rule of basic human decency, and his peers were excommunicating him in real time. Blake took a step back, bumping into the main table. The crystal glasses rattled. He looked at Eleanor, pleading for his mother to intervene, but Eleanor was paralyzed. She was staring at the wealthy guests around her, realizing that her social standing was completely, irrevocably destroyed. She was officially a pariah. I looked back at my parents. My father had his arm wrapped tightly around my mother. She was weeping into his shoulder, but Audrey was standing tall beside them, his jaw set in a hard line, ensuring no one dared to brush past them again. The sight of my family standing strong despite the humiliation they had endured fueled the final embers of my rage into a blazing inferno of justice. You thought I was just a quiet girl from the Midwest who would swallow your abuse to keep the peace. I told Blake, staring directly into his soul. You thought because I did not scream and shout when you disrespected my roots that I was weak. You mistook my patience for submission. You thought my love made me blind to your toxicity. But I see you now. I see your mother. I see the hollow, bankrupt reality of your entire family. You threw away my family legacy to protect your fake image, Blake, I said, bringing my voice back down to a lethal, calm register. And today, you let your mother shove my parents to the back of the room by the kitchen doors, all while you tried to steal $200,000 from me to pay off illegal gambling debts. You wanted a high society wedding. You wanted to look like a titan of industry. But you are nothing but a cheap, cowardly thief in a borrowed tuxedo, and I am going to make absolutely certain that everyone in this room sees exactly what you are. The words hit Blake like a physical strike. His pristine, carefully curated image was completely shattered. He looked around the room, seeing the disgust in the eyes of his colleagues, the horror on the faces of his supposed friends. He saw his managing partner actively typing on his phone, undoubtedly drafting an immediate termination email to the Human Resources Department. The reality of his absolute destruction finally penetrated his thick skull. And when a severe narcissist loses control of their false narrative, they do not apologize. They attack. A guttural, animalistic sound ripped from Blake's throat. It was not a word, just a roar of pure, unfiltered panic and rage. He shoved his chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed against the marble floor. He abandoned every ounce of his fake sophistication and lunged toward the stage. His face was contorted into an ugly mask of fury, his hands outstretched, aiming directly for me. He wanted the microphone. He wanted to silence me. He wanted to use physical intimidation to regain control of a situation that had slipped entirely from his grasp. "Shut up!" he screamed, his voice cracking hysterically. "Shut your mouth right now, Audrey. Give me that microphone." I did not take a single step back. I did not flinch. I did not drop the microphone. I stood perfectly still in my custom designer gown, looking down at the man charging at me like a deranged lunatic. I had faced down hostile corporate raiders and aggressive billionaires in windowless boardrooms. A pathetic, desperate man in a rented tuxedo was never going to make me retreat. I did not even need to raise my hand to defend myself. I had planned for every possible contingency today. When you manage billions of dollars in high-risk assets, you do not rely on standard venue security. I had hired my own private security detail for the wedding. They were 3 highly trained former military professionals who answered exclusively to me and my payroll. They had been standing quietly in the shadows near the edge of the stage, blending in seamlessly with the event staff waiting for my signal. They did not wait for him to reach the stairs. Before Blake's foot could even touch the first step of the stage, a massive figure in a tailored black suit intercepted him. The lead security officer, a man named Jackson, moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. Jackson grabbed Blake's outstretched arm, applied a brutal joint lock, and twisted it sharply behind Blake's back. Blake let out a sharp yelp of pain as his forward momentum was instantly and violently halted. Within a fraction of a second, the other two guards materialized from the flanks. They grabbed Blake's shoulders and forced him down. The polished marble floor met Blake's face with a loud, sickening smack. They pinned him flat on his stomach, his expensive Italian tuxedo instantly collecting the dust of his own ruined reception. One guard held his legs securely, while Jackson kept Blake's arms locked tightly behind his back, applying just enough pressure to ensure he could not move a single muscle. Blake was struggling frantically, gasping for air against the hard floor, his perfectly styled hair now a sweaty, disheveled mess. "Let me go," he wheezed, spit flying from his lips as he writhed against the heavy weight of the guards. "You cannot do this. I am the groom. Let me up right now." Eleanor let out a piercing, hysterical shriek from the main table. She rushed forward, her designer heels clicking frantically, but stopped short when one of the guards shot her a cold, lethal warning glare that promised immediate physical restraint if she took one more step. The entire ballroom was on their feet. The tense silence had been completely obliterated, replaced by a chaotic symphony of gasps, shouting, and the rapid snapping of smartphone cameras. My colleagues from Wall Street were actively recording the groom pinned to the floor like a common criminal. They were capturing every second of his absolute humiliation, ready to send the footage across every financial network in the city. Audrey stepped forward, placing himself firmly between the chaos and my parents, ensuring Henry and Martha were completely shielded from the madness. He looked down at Blake writhing on the floor with an expression of pure, icy satisfaction. I looked down at the man I had almost married. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical satisfaction. He thought silencing my voice would stop the truth from coming out. He thought physical intimidation could save his fabricated empire. But the microphone was just the warm-up. I turned my attention away from the pathetic display on the floor and looked up at the massive projection screen hanging above the stage. It was the screen originally meant to display our romantic wedding montage. I caught the eye of my executive assistant, Evan, who was standing by the audio-visual booth at the back of the room. I gave him a slight, definitive nod. It was time to stop talking and start projecting the receipts. Evan did not hesitate. He hit the master switch on the audio-visual control board. The motorized hum of 3 massive high-definition projection screens lowering from the ceiling echoed through the ballroom. The lighting in the room automatically dimmed, shifting the focus entirely to the glowing white rectangles hovering above the stage. Usually, this is the part of the evening where the guests are treated to a heartwarming montage. Childhood pictures, awkward high school photos, and a romantic timeline of the couple falling in love to the tune of a soft acoustic guitar. Instead, the screens illuminated with a stark, blindingly bright display of high-resolution banking documents. I turned my back to Blake, who was still pinned securely to the floor by Jackson, and gestured up at the center screen. My voice resonated through the speakers with the crisp, authoritative cadence of a senior executive delivering a quarterly earnings report. "Let us start with the foundation of this beautiful evening," I announced, walking slowly across the stage. Blake has spent the last 6 months telling anyone who would listen that his family was sparing no expense to welcome me into their prestigious bloodline. He told his colleagues, his friends, and even my own parents that the Blackwell wealth was funding this entire extravagant affair. I pointed a finger at the screen. The document displayed was the master contract for the 5-star coastal resort. The text was magnified, so every single guest, even those seated at the very back of the room, could read the bold print. "Take a close look at the billing section," I instructed the crowd. "Notice the name on the primary account. Notice the routing number. That is not a Blackwell trust fund. That is my personal checking account." I gave Evan another nod and the slide changed. It was a rapid-fire succession of cleared wire transfers and paid invoices. $80,000 to secure the grand ballroom, I read aloud as the first receipt flashed. $40,000 for the custom catering menu, including the imported caviar that Eleanor explicitly demanded. $25,000 for the floral arrangements. $15,000 for the open bar heavily stocked with the vintage champagne that Eleanor and her sister have been consuming all afternoon. I paused, letting the sheer magnitude of the numbers sink into the minds of the guests. I looked down at Blake, whose face was pressed against the marble floor. I even paid $12,000 for the custom Italian tuxedo, currently collecting dust on the ground. I said, my voice dripping with absolute disdain. Blake claimed his end-of-year bonus was tied up in corporate restructuring. He looked me in the eye and asked me to cover his attire, promising he would reimburse me the moment his funds cleared. I paid for the clothes on his back because I believed we were building a partnership. But there was no delayed bonus. There was only a man perfectly content to let a woman finance his illusion of success. The atmosphere in the ballroom was electric. The high-net-worth individuals in attendance were absolutely captivated. In the cutthroat environment of Wall Street, lying about capital is the ultimate cardinal sin. You can be aggressive, you can be ruthless, but you cannot be broke and pretend you are a billionaire. The executives sitting near the front row were physically recoiling from the main table where Eleanor was sitting. They were looking at her as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. Eleanor could not handle the public exposure. Her entire identity was wrapped up in the perception of unearned superiority. She stood up from her chair, her hands shaking violently. "This is a fabrication!" Eleanor screamed, her voice cracking as she pointed a manicured finger at the projection screens. "You forged these documents. You are a bitter, hysterical girl trying to embarrass us because you feel inadequate in our presence. My family has resources you cannot even comprehend." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I held the absolute high ground, and I was about to drop a financial nuclear bomb directly on her head. Resources. I repeated softly, the word echoing dangerously through the quiet room. That is a fascinating choice of vocabulary, Eleanor. Let us talk about your resources. Let us talk about the vast, untouchable Blackwell fortune you have been weaponizing against my parents all day. I looked at Evan. He knew exactly what to do. He bypassed the rest of the wedding receipts and pulled up a heavily encrypted, highly confidential legal file. The screens flashed, replacing the wedding invoices with a dense, complex legal contract. At the very top, printed in bold, undeniable lettering, were the words, "Notice of default and intent to foreclose." The finance professionals in the room instantly recognized the format. A sharp collective murmur swept through the crowd. I saw Blake's managing partner take out his reading glasses, leaning forward in his chair to analyze the document displayed above the stage. "For those of you who do not spend your days analyzing distressed debt portfolios, allow me to translate," I said, pacing back to the center of the stage. "What you are looking at is the official mortgage documentation for Eleanor's sprawling, supposedly debt-free suburban estate." Eleanor's face lost every single ounce of color. She looked like all the blood had been instantly drained from her body. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to grab the edge of the silk tablecloth to keep from collapsing onto the floor. "You love to talk about your estate, Eleanor," I continued, my voice sharp and relentless. "You love to host garden parties and brag about your property value. But you omitted a tiny crucial detail from your socialite narrative. You have not made a mortgage payment in 7 months. The gasp from the crowd was audible. You took out 3 consecutive high-interest secondary loans against the equity of your home to fund your designer wardrobe, your luxury car leases, and your completely fabricated lifestyle, I stated, laying her financial ruin bare for the entire world to see. You are drowning in toxic debt. You are financially insolvent. 2 weeks ago, your primary lender finalized the paperwork to seize your property and evict you. They were preparing to put your beautiful, pristine estate on the auction block." I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the absolute devastation of my words settle over the room. I looked at my parents standing tall beside Audrey. My father, the hard-working Iowa farmer who owned his land free and clear, was watching the woman who called him poor completely unravel. "But banks are practical institutions," I explained to the captivated audience. "They do not actually want to go through the messy, time-consuming process of eviction and public auction if they do not have to. They prefer to offload toxic assets to private buyers who are willing to absorb the risk for a discounted premium." I gestured to Evan. The slide transitioned one final time. This new document was a certificate of transfer and assignment of deed of trust. It was the absolute undeniable proof of ownership. 4 days ago, a private holding company stepped in and purchased your distressed debt portfolio directly from your lender. I said, my eyes locking onto Eleanor's terrified face. They paid cash. They bought the note, the deed, and the absolute legal right to your property. Eleanor was shaking her head frantically. No, she whispered, though her voice carried in the silent room. No, that is impossible. My lawyer said we had more time. We were negotiating. You were begging, I corrected her coldly. And your bank stopped listening. They sold your debt to a private entity. I walked right up to the edge of the stage, looking directly down at the woman who had spent the last year trying to make me feel small. Do you know who owns that private holding company, Eleanor? I asked, lowering my voice to a lethal quiet register. She stared up at me, her eyes wide with absolute primal terror. The realization was slowly dawning on her, crashing through her layers of delusion and denial. I own it, I stated clearly, the words hitting like physical strikes. I am the sole managing member of that LLC. I used my own capital earned through grueling hours of hard work on Wall Street to purchase the mortgage on your home. I let a cold, ruthless smile touch my lips. You do not owe the bank anymore, Eleanor. You owe me. I am your primary creditor. I hold the deed to the house you sleep in. I own the roof over your head. I own the manicured lawn you park your leased luxury cars on. I possess the absolute unilateral legal authority to initiate foreclosure proceedings and have the sheriff's department remove your belongings and place them on the curb. Eleanor let out a choked, desperate sob. She covered her mouth with her trembling hands. The grand, untouchable matriarch of the Blackwell family was publicly exposed as a broke, desperate fraud, completely at the mercy of the Iowa farm girl she had relentlessly despised. You sat at a table that I paid for, I said, my voice rising with righteous, unyielding fury. You drank champagne that I purchased. You looked at my parents, two people who have more honor, integrity, and financial stability in their little fingers than you have in your entire lineage, and you called them poor. You tried to banish them to the kitchen doors because you thought they did not fit your aesthetic. I pointed a finger directly at her chest. You are a parasite, Eleanor. You and your son are financial predators who tried to use my bank accounts to fund your delusions of grandeur. You thought you could smile in my face while simultaneously plotting to drain my assets to pay off your underground gambling debts. You thought you were the apex predator in this room. But you walked into the wrong arena and you tried to play a game you do not have the capital to survive. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. No one moved. No one whispered. 200 people were bearing witness to a total, flawless financial execution. I own your home. Eleanor, I finalized, my voice echoing with finality. And as of 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, my legal team will be filing the paperwork to execute the eviction. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your designer bags and vacate my property. The echo of my ultimatum faded into the cavernous space of the ballroom. Eleanor collapsed entirely, her knees hitting the marble floor as she buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Nobody moved to comfort her. Her own relatives at the main table remained frozen, utterly paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her financial and social annihilation. Then a new sound broke the heavy silence. Steady, deliberate footsteps echoed across the room. I looked past the stage monitors and saw Audrey stepping away from my parents. He gave my father a brief, respectful nod, ensuring they were safe before he turned his massive frame toward the stage. His wife, Caroline, lunged forward and grabbed the sleeve of his tailored suit. Audrey, what are you doing? Caroline hissed, her face contorted with panic. Do not get involved in this. Mom is on the floor. Blake is being humiliated. We need to do damage control. Get back here. Audrey did not even look at her. He simply flexed his arm, breaking her weak grip with effortless precision. I am doing the only honorable thing left to do in this room, he replied, his voice carrying a cold, heavy finality. I am stepping out of the mud. He walked past the stunned guests, ascending the side stairs of the stage with the imposing presence of a seasoned litigator entering a courtroom. He stopped right beside me. For a moment, we just looked at each other. There was no pity in his eyes, only a profound mutual respect. He understood exactly what I was doing. He respected the surgical precision of my retaliation. From the inner pocket of his suit jacket, Audrey produced a sleek black leather folio. It looked like a standard legal brief, the kind used in high-stakes corporate depositions. He held it out to me. I have spent my entire career defending the truth. Andre said, his deep voice easily picked up by the microphone I was still holding. I could not stand by and let you sign a marriage certificate today. Not after what my private investigator handed me at 6:00 this morning. I took the folio. The leather was cool against my palms. You hired a private investigator? I asked, genuinely surprised but instantly intrigued. I am a corporate attorney, Andre replied smoothly, turning his gaze toward Blake, who was still pinned to the floor by my security team, sweating through his expensive collar. When Blake bragged to me last month about how he managed to avoid signing a prenup with a Wall Street hedge fund manager, my instincts triggered. Men who brag about avoiding prenups are usually hiding massive liabilities. I initiated a discreet background check to ensure he was not trying to leverage my legal firm for any of his shady offshore accounts. I was looking for hidden debt. Andre paused, letting a grim, disgusted expression settle over his face. I found the gambling debts which you already exposed brilliantly. But my investigator also flagged a series of highly erratic charges on his corporate expense account. Charges that occurred yesterday, less than 24 hours ago. I flipped the leather folio open. Inside was a stack of high-resolution 8x10 photographs accompanied by a printed digital receipt from the front desk of a prominent luxury hotel downtown. I stared at the top photograph. The image was crystal clear, time-stamped at 11:45 last night. It was an exterior shot of the hotel entrance. There was Blake wearing a casual designer jacket I had bought him for his birthday. His arm was wrapped tightly around the waist of a brunette woman. She was wearing a very short, very expensive-looking cocktail dress. They were leaning into each other, laughing, completely oblivious to the camera lens capturing their every move. I recognized the woman immediately. She was Blake's former executive assistant. She had abruptly left his investment firm 3 months ago to supposedly pursue a career in real estate. Blake had told me they had mutually agreed her skills were better suited elsewhere. I flipped to the next photo. Time-stamped 2 hours later. A shot through the glass windows of the hotel balcony. Blake and the former assistant intimately entangled. There was zero ambiguity. It was graphic, undeniable, and repulsive. Finally, I looked at the receipt. It was a reservation confirmation for the penthouse suite. The billing information showed it was paid for using Blake's corporate credit card. The exact same corporate card monitored by the managing partner currently sitting in the front row of my reception. I felt a new icy wave of adrenaline wash over me. I had just dismantled his finances and his mother's fake empire. Now Andre had handed me the weapon to obliterate his personal character and his career in one swift, brutal strike. I looked up from the folio and stared down at Blake. His face was pressed against the floor, but he was craning his neck trying to see what I was holding. The sheer panic in his eyes was glorious to witness. "Jackson," I said into the microphone, addressing my lead security officer. "Let him up, but keep him on his knees." Jackson effortlessly hauled Blake up by his collar, forcing him onto his knees at the base of the stage. Blake was panting, his tuxedo jacket rumpled, his bow tie hanging loosely around his neck. "Audrey, whatever he gave you, it is a lie," Blake stammered, his voice cracking. "Andre has always hated me. He is trying to sabotage me because I am moving up faster in the corporate world than he is. Do not listen to him." I held up the printed receipt, turning it so the bright stage lights illuminated the text. "Are you claiming Andre hacked into the hotel database and forged a corporate expense report?" I asked, my voice slicing through his pathetic lies. "Because I am currently holding a receipt for a penthouse suite booked yesterday at 4 in the afternoon. You told me you were spending the evening with your groomsmen reviewing your vows. You told me you wanted a quiet night to reflect on the gravity of the commitment you were about to make." I pulled out the top photograph and held it up for the entire ballroom to see. The high-definition image of Blake and his former assistant was unmistakable. You did not spend the night reflecting on our vows, Blake, I announced, projecting my voice so every single guest heard the betrayal. You spent the eve of our wedding sleeping with your former executive assistant. You spent the night in a hotel suite that you charged to your investment firm's corporate expense account. A collective shockwave rolled through the room. Cheating on your bride the night before the wedding was a moral atrocity. Charging the hotel room to your company was a fireable offense. Doing both, and then showing up to a $500,000 wedding funded entirely by the woman you betrayed, was a level of depravity that defied human comprehension. I saw Blake's managing partner stand up from his chair. His face was a mask of absolute professional fury. He did not yell. He did not cause a scene. He simply looked at Blake, shook his head once in sheer disgust, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked directly toward the exit. The human resources executive followed immediately behind him. Blake's career on Wall Street was officially permanently terminated. He was dead to the industry. Blake let out a pathetic, whimpering sob. He dropped his head, staring at the marble floor, completely out of lies to tell. I turned to Audrey and held out the microphone. He did not even hesitate. He took it from my hand, turning to face the sprawling ballroom. He stood tall, a beacon of absolute integrity, in a room that had been poisoned by his in-law's arrogance. For 5 years, I have sat at Sunday dinners with the Blackwell family. Audrey began, his deep, resonant voice commanding the absolute attention of every person in the building. I have listened to their thinly veiled, racist remarks. I have watched them sneer at service workers, belittle working-class people, and project a fabricated image of superiority that they absolutely did not earn. I tolerated it because I believed in the sanctity of marriage, and I hoped that eventually Caroline and I could distance ourselves from this toxic environment. He looked directly at Eleanor, who was still trembling on the floor, and then at Caroline, who was watching him with wide, terrified eyes. But today I watched this family hit absolute rock bottom. Audrey continued, his tone dripping with righteous condemnation. I watched Eleanor Blackwell look at 2 honest, hard-working farmers from Iowa and banish them to the kitchen doors like they were contaminated. I watched a mother prioritize a fake social aesthetic over basic human decency. And I watched Blake stand by and allow it to happen, all while actively plotting to steal from the brilliant woman who was generous enough to pay for the suit on his back. Audrey pointed down at Blake kneeling on the floor. "This man represents everything that is wrong with entitlement," Audrey declared. "He is a coward, a fraud, and a liability. He thought he could sleep with his former assistant on Friday, steal $200,000 on Saturday afternoon, and smile for the wedding photos on Saturday evening. He thought he was the smartest person in the room, but he forgot that true power does not come from inherited names or fake social status. True power comes from hard work, intelligence, and undeniable integrity. Traits that Audrey possesses in abundance. Traits that this family lacks entirely." Audrey turned his gaze toward the rest of the Blackwell relatives sitting frozen at the main table. "You are all complicit," he said, his voice echoing like a judge's gavel. "You sat there drinking her champagne, knowing exactly how Eleanor treats people, knowing exactly what kind of man Blake is. You enabled this rot. You cheered for it." He paused, letting the heavy silence amplify his final devastating decree. "As an attorney, I have represented major corporations against hostile fraud," Audrey stated. "Starting Monday morning, I will be formally representing Audrey. I am going to ensure that every single asset Blake attempted to compromise is aggressively defended. I will personally oversee the legal filings to refer his wire fraud attempt to federal authorities. We are going to examine every bank statement, every offshore transfer, and every corporate expense report." He handed the microphone back to me and looked out at the audience one last time. "The Blackwell family is morally and financially bankrupt," Audrey concluded, "and I refuse to share a name, a table, or a life with anyone who defends them." The guests erupted into spontaneous, thunderous applause. It was not polite wedding clapping. It was the fierce, validating applause of a crowd witnessing absolute justice being served. My Wall Street colleagues were nodding in deep respect. The corporate executives were openly cheering for Audrey's uncompromising stance. I stood on the stage, the leather folio in one hand, and the microphone in the other. I looked down at Blake, who was now weeping openly, a broken, pathetic shell of the arrogant man he had pretended to be. I looked at Eleanor, whose entire fake empire had been reduced to ashes in front of the very society she worshipped. Audrey had just handed me the final nail for their coffin, and he had delivered it with unparalleled grace and power. The truth was completely out in the open. The masquerade was over. There were no more secrets left to hide behind. The immediate aftermath was a masterclass in corporate excommunication. In the ruthless ecosystem of high finance, your reputation is your primary currency. Once that currency is proven counterfeit, you are instantly liquidated. The 200 guests in the ballroom did not just watch Blake fall. They actively participated in his eradication. At the table directly to the right of the stage, the senior partners of Blake's investment firm moved with synchronized clinical precision. The managing director, a man whose approval Blake had spent the last 2 years desperately courting, stood up. He did not look at Blake with anger. He looked at him with the cold, detached expression of a surgeon excising a tumor. The director pulled his smartphone from his tailored jacket, dialed a number, and held the phone to his ear as he stepped into the center aisle. "Cancel all of Blake's access codes immediately," the managing director instructed, his voice slicing through the ambient murmurs of the room. "Contact building security. Have his desk boxed up and left at the loading dock. He is barred from the premises. Notify the compliance department that we have a confirmed incident of corporate expense fraud and potential offshore wire violations. I want a full audit of his accounts by Monday morning." He ended the call, slid the phone back into his pocket, and buttoned his jacket. He turned his gaze toward the stage, gave me a sharp, respectful nod of acknowledgement, and walked straight out of the grand double doors without a single backward glance. The human resources executive and the rest of the firm's senior partners followed him in absolute silence, a procession of dark suits exiting the venue and permanently closing the door on Blake's career. The exodus did not stop there. The VIP tables previously occupied by the wealthy socialites and business magnates Eleanor had so carefully curated began to empty. These were people who managed multi-million-dollar portfolios, individuals who valued discretion, loyalty, and above all, financial integrity. Watching a groom attempt to siphon $200,000 from his bride's account to pay off illegal gambling syndicates while charging a hotel room with his mistress to his corporate card was a radioactive level of liability. Nobody wanted the stench of Blake's fraud lingering on their own reputations. Chairs scraped against the marble floor. Wealthy guests stood up collecting their designer coats and evening bags. Mobile phones illuminated across the dim ballroom as executives fired off rapid emails and text messages to their own compliance officers, ensuring their firms severed any existing ties or pending contracts with Blake. Blake, still kneeling on the floor under the watchful eyes of my security team, realized the catastrophic finality of what was happening. His breathing became erratic. He scrambled against the polished marble, trying to crawl toward the departing executives. "Richard, please wait!" Blake begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine as he reached a trembling hand toward a departing client. "It is a misunderstanding. I can explain the charges. We have the merger on Tuesday. You need my analysis. Please just give me 5 minutes to explain." The client, a towering man with silver hair, stopped and looked down at Blake as if he had just stepped in something foul on the sidewalk. "You do not have an analysis," the client stated, his tone dripping with absolute disdain. "You do not have a job. You do not have a future in this industry. Do not ever contact my firm again." The client turned on his heel and walked away. Blake let out a hollow, agonizing gasp, his hands clutching his head as he curled into a tight, miserable ball on the floor. His carefully constructed illusion of elite status was entirely pulverized. He was bankrupt, unemployed, and publicly disgraced in front of the most powerful people in the city. Eleanor watched her coveted high society connections evaporate in real time. The friends she had spent years trying to impress were walking out the door, deliberately avoiding her gaze. She reached out to a passing socialite, grasping at the woman's silk wrap. "Margaret, please," Eleanor cried out, her face streaked with ruined makeup. "You know us. We are good people. This is just a terrible mistake." The socialite snatched her wrap out of Eleanor's hand with a violent jerk. "You are a complete embarrassment, Eleanor," the woman snapped coldly. "Do not ever call my house again." As the ballroom steadily emptied of its most prestigious attendees, Audrey stepped forward, moving to the very edge of the stage. He looked down at the remaining guests, his commanding presence demanding absolute attention. He was no longer just a supportive brother-in-law. He was a top-tier corporate litigator stepping fully into his element, ready to deliver the final legal execution. "Let there be no confusion about what happens next," Audrey announced, his deep voice carrying an unwavering authority. "The actions we have witnessed today transcend moral failure. They cross the line into severe criminal misconduct. Attempting to execute a fraudulent wire transfer of $200,000 across international lines to offshore gambling syndicates constitutes federal wire fraud. Utilizing a corporate expense account to facilitate personal infidelity constitutes corporate embezzlement." Audrey pointed a rigid finger directly at Blake, who flinched violently. "I am officially taking over as Audrey's lead legal counsel," Audrey declared, the sheer weight of his statement solidifying the alliance between us. "Tomorrow morning, my firm will be filing a comprehensive civil suit against you for attempted financial fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Simultaneously, we will be handing over the IP logs, the biometric denial records from Audrey's smartwatch, and the corporate hotel receipts directly to the federal authorities and the Internal Revenue Service." The remaining guests murmured in stark validation. An African-American corporate lawyer representing a powerhouse female hedge fund manager against a fraudulent entitled thief was a legal nightmare Blake could never hope to survive. Audrey was relentless, a man of absolute integrity who was fully prepared to use the full extent of the law to crush the parasite kneeling on the floor. "You thought you could manipulate your way to the top?" Audrey continued, his eyes locked onto Blake. "You thought you could exploit a brilliant woman and discard her family to feed your own pathetic ego. But you fundamentally misunderstood the rules of engagement. You are not a predator. You are a cautionary tale. And I am going to ensure that every single legal avenue is utilized to make you face the maximum penalty for your crimes." Audrey turned to look at me, giving me a firm, resolute nod. He had drawn the legal battle lines, establishing an impenetrable fortress around my assets and my future. He had systematically dismantled Blake's remaining defenses, ensuring that the coward on the floor had absolutely no route of escape. The fallout was complete. The social rejection was absolute. The legal destruction was officially guaranteed. I stood on the stage, looking out at the shattered remnants of the Blackwell family, knowing the final crushing blow was entirely mine to deliver. Eleanor looked around the vast, rapidly emptying ballroom. The crystal chandeliers cast a harsh, unforgiving light on her ruined designer dress. Her affluent socialite friends had vanished into the night. Her son was a disgraced, unemployable corporate outcast waiting for federal charges. And I held the absolute legal deed to her sprawling suburban estate. The psychological weight of her total financial and social destruction finally snapped her spine. Eleanor collapsed. Her knees slammed heavily against the polished marble floor. She let out a guttural, wretched sob that stripped away every single ounce of her fabricated high society elegance. She crawled forward, reaching her trembling hands toward the edge of the stage, her tear-streaked face staring up at me in absolute primal desperation. "Audrey, please," Eleanor begged, her voice a wet, pathetic gasp. "Please do not do this. You cannot take my home. It is everything I have left. I will apologize to your parents. I will get on my hands and knees and beg them for forgiveness right now. I will make Blake sign whatever legal documents you want. Just please do not evict me. You have so much capital. You are so wealthy. You do not need my house. I have absolutely nowhere else to go." I looked down at her. I did not feel a single flicker of empathy. My eyes were entirely devoid of warmth, reflecting the cold, calculating nature of a Wall Street manager terminating a highly toxic asset. "You fundamentally misunderstand the mechanics of a foreclosure, Eleanor," I stated, my voice echoing with icy detachment. "This is not a negotiation. You spent the entire day mocking my parents because they work with their hands in the dirt. You tried to publicly humiliate them because they do not wear expensive luxury labels. But my parents own their Iowa farmhouse free and clear. You built a paper castle on a mountain of high-interest debt and now the wind is blowing. Eleanor sobbed louder, reaching out to clutch the hem of my custom wedding gown. I calmly took a step back, pulling the expensive silk fabric out of her desperate, grasping hands. You do not get to demand mercy after spending a year treating my family like garbage. I continued staring directly into her terrified, bloodshot eyes. You defaulted on your financial obligations. I purchased your debt. I am simply collecting my collateral. You have 48 hours to vacate my property before the sheriff removes you by force. I turned my head and locked eyes with the general manager of the coastal resort. He was a tall, sharply dressed man, standing at attention near the main entrance, waiting for my signal. I had wired $500,000 to his property. I was the absolute financial authority in this room. I gave him a brief, definitive nod and pointed directly at Eleanor Blake and the remaining Blackwell relatives cowering at the ruined main table. "Clear these uninvited people out of my resort!" I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy air with absolute finality. "Right now, throw them out on the street." The general manager did not hesitate for a single second. He raised his right hand, tapped his earpiece, and issued a sharp, inaudible command. Instantly, a dozen resort security personnel materialized from the perimeter of the ballroom. These were not standard event bouncers. They were highly trained professionals dressed in immaculate dark suits, and they moved with terrifying synchronized efficiency. They formed a solid, impenetrable wall around the main table where the remaining members of the Blackwell family were still frozen in shock. The distant cousins, aunts, and uncles who had been laughing, drinking my vintage champagne, and occupying the VIP seats just an hour ago suddenly realized the gravity of their situation. They were no longer guests at a luxury wedding. They were trespassers about to be forcibly ejected from a five-star property. Panic swept through their ranks. They scrambled to grab their cheap clutches and suit jackets, knocking over the heavy gold chairs in their desperate haste to comply. They scuttled away from the table like rats fleeing a sinking ship, completely abandoning Eleanor and Blake to face the wrath of the resort staff alone. Eleanor, however, refused to accept her reality. The grand, arrogant matriarch anchored her hands to the heavy silk tablecloth, her knuckles turning white as she desperately tried to maintain her physical position in the room. Two large security guards flanked her immediately. One of them calmly but firmly instructed her to stand up and walk toward the exit. Eleanor unleashed a wild, hysterical shriek. "You cannot touch me!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she wildly flailed her arms. "I am a Blackwell. I know the owners of this property. I will sue this entire establishment into the ground. I will have your jobs. Do not put your hands on me." The general manager stepped forward, completely unbothered by her frantic threats. "Ma'am, you are currently trespassing on a private, fully rented venue," he stated, his voice ringing with absolute icy professionalism. "The rightful host has revoked your invitation. If you do not walk out on your own 2 feet, my staff will physically remove you, and I will personally press charges for disturbing the peace." Eleanor spat a vile curse at him, digging her heels into the marble floor. The manager gave a slight nod. The two security guards immediately seized Eleanor by her upper arms. They did not use excessive force, but their grip was absolute steel. They lifted her effortlessly from the chair. Eleanor's legs completely gave out beneath her, either from the sheer shock of the physical contact or the crushing weight of her financial ruin. She went entirely limp, forcing the heavily muscled guards to literally drag her backward across the ballroom floor. Her designer heels scuffed violently against the polished marble. The fabric of her expensive gown bunched up around her knees, exposing her to the unblinking lenses of dozens of smartphones still recording the spectacle. She kicked, she thrashed, and she wailed, sounding like a wounded animal being dragged to the slaughter. It was the ultimate devastating visual of a fake socialite being violently ripped from the high society she had worshipped her entire life. But before the security guards could drag Eleanor completely through the grand double doors, a massive commotion erupted from the main lobby. The heavy oak doors were pushed wide open from the outside, hitting the walls, with a loud, resounding thud. The unmistakable, sharp crackle of a police radio cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom. I looked past the struggling form of my former mother-in-law and saw the flashing red and blue lights of multiple patrol cruisers reflecting violently against the glass windows of the resort entrance. 4 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives marched into the grand reception hall. Their presence instantly drained the remaining oxygen from the room. They walked with urgent tactical purpose, their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts. Audrey stepped down from the stage, his tailored suit shifting flawlessly across his broad shoulders. He walked down the center aisle to meet the lead detective halfway. The two men shook hands firmly, a gesture of mutual professional respect. Detective Ramirez Andre said, his deep voice carrying an unwavering authority. "Thank you for arriving so quickly. As we discussed on the phone, I am the reporting party." Andre reached into his breast pocket and produced a sleek, encrypted USB drive. He handed it directly to the detective. "This drive contains the complete unedited IP routing logs from the offshore gambling syndicate," Andre explained, ensuring his voice was loud enough for Blake to hear every single devastating syllable. "It also contains the biometric denial records triggered by the unauthorized wire transfer attempt of $200,000. Furthermore, I have included the digital corporate expense receipts from the downtown hotel, proving a gross misuse of company funds. The financial timeline is absolutely undeniable. He attempted to execute the fraudulent transfer exactly 22 minutes ago, utilizing the venue's wireless network." The detective pocketed the USB drive and gave Andre a solemn nod. "We have the digital footprint secured on our end as well, Counselor. The Financial Crimes Division was flagged the moment the offshore routing sequence hit the federal watch list. We appreciate the clean handover." The detective bypassed Andre and marched straight toward the base of the stage. Blake was still kneeling on the floor, his arms pinned securely behind his back by my private security team. When Blake saw the silver badge clipped to the detective's belt, the very last drop of arrogant defiance evaporated from his body. A dark, spreading stain suddenly appeared on the trousers of the custom Italian tuxedo I had paid for. Blake had wet himself. The sheer, overwhelming terror of federal prison had broken his bladder. It was the absolute, pathetic physical manifestation of his cowardice. He was a man who tried to play the role of a Wall Street predator, reduced to a trembling, soiled mess on the floor of his own ruined wedding. My private security officers stepped back, transferring the physical custody of the prisoner directly to the police. 2 uniformed officers hauled Blake roughly to his feet. Blake Blackwell, the lead detective, announced, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "You are under arrest for attempted wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." The heavy metallic rattle of handcuffs echoed sharply through the quiet ballroom. The officer pulled Blake's arms backward, applying the cold steel cuffs to his wrists. The ratcheting teeth locked into place with a loud, definitive click. Blake squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his flushed, sweaty face. He tried to pull his arms forward, a weak, futile gesture of resistance against the solid grip of the police officers. He looked up at the stage, his eyes locking onto mine. He looked completely unhinged, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Audrey, please." Blake begged, his voice a high-pitched, desperate whine. "Please tell them to stop. Tell them it was just a marital dispute. Tell them it was our joint account and I had authorization. You are my wife. You cannot let them do this to me. I will pay it back. I will fix the mortgage. Just tell them we are married." I looked down at him. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a perfectly executed liquidation. I leaned forward, looking directly into his terrified, tear-filled eyes. "I never signed the marriage certificate, Blake," I stated, my voice slicing through his delusions like a scalpel. "I told the officiant to hold the paperwork in his office because I wanted to review the final draft. We are not legally married. You are not my husband. You are just a desperate, unemployed thief who tried to break into my bank account." Blake let out a hollow, agonizing gasp. His legs gave out entirely, and the 2 police officers had to physically hold him upright by his armpits. His final lifeline, the protective shield of marital assets, had never even existed. Seeing her golden boy handcuffed and completely destroyed, Eleanor broke out of her catatonic shock. She managed to wrench her left arm free from the resort security guard for a split second. She lunged wildly toward the detectives, her designer dress tearing at the seam. "You cannot take him!" Eleanor shrieked, her face contorted with madness. "He is a Blackwell. That woman framed him. She set a trap to steal our family legacy. Arrest her." A female police officer instantly stepped forward, intercepting Eleanor's frantic charge. The officer grabbed Eleanor's shoulder, spun her around, and pinned her firmly against the nearest marble pillar. "Mom, you need to step back immediately," the police officer commanded, her tone brooking absolutely no argument. "If you attempt to interfere with a federal arrest or assault an officer of the law, I will put you in handcuffs and charge you with obstruction of justice. Do you understand me?" Eleanor froze, her chest heaving as she stared at the officer's utility belt. The threat of being thrown into the back of a squad car finally penetrated her hysteria. She slumped against the pillar, defeated, broken, and completely devoid of her fabricated social power. The resort security guards immediately stepped back in seizing her arms once again. They did not hesitate this time. They dragged the screaming, flailing woman straight out the grand double doors, pulling her roughly through the lobby and tossing her out onto the front curb of the resort. The police officers turned Blake around and marched him down the center aisle. He stumbled with every step, his head hung low in absolute shame, shuffling past the rows of elite guests who were watching his exit with cold, silent condemnation. The remaining members of the Blackwell family scurried closely behind the police escort. They held their suit jackets and clutches over their faces, desperately trying to hide their identities from the sea of smartphones still recording every humiliating second of their departure. They looked like cockroaches fleeing a burning building. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung shut behind them with a loud, resounding thud. The storm was over. The toxic infection had been surgically removed from the premises. I stood on the stage, the microphone resting quietly at my side. I looked out at the vast ballroom. The main VIP table, once occupied by a family of arrogant, entitled frauds, now sat entirely empty. The gold chargers gleamed under the chandeliers, waiting for the people who actually deserved to sit there. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute, unadulterated weight of my freedom. I had not just defended my assets, I had systematically dismantled a family of predators and ensured they would never ever have the power to victimize anyone else again. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom remained firmly shut, but the energy inside the grand reception hall was still crackling with raw residual electricity. My security team seamlessly shifted back into their perimeter positions, their postures relaxed, but vigilant. The Wall Street elite in the audience began to murmur, processing the sheer magnitude of the financial and social execution they had just witnessed. I lowered the microphone, the cool metal serving as a grounding weight in my palm. But the reckoning in this room was not entirely finished. There was one final, deeply entrenched thread of the Blackwell toxicity that needed to be severed. Near the front of the stage, Caroline Blake's sister stood trembling. Unlike the rest of her cowardly relatives who had scurried out behind the police escort, she had remained frozen in place. Her face was a twisted, ugly mask of devastation and furious disbelief. She stared at the empty double doors, then slowly turned her gaze toward Audrey. Her husband. The man who had just handed federal authorities the exact digital evidence required to put her brother in a federal prison cell. She marched toward him, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. She did not look like a grieving sister or a concerned wife. She looked like a cornered, venomous snake. "How could you?" Caroline hissed, her voice vibrating with hysterical, unhinged rage. "How could you do that to your own family, Audrey? You handed my brother over to the police like a common criminal. You let that Iowa farm girl humiliate my mother and steal our home. You are supposed to be my husband. You are supposed to protect us from people like her." Audrey did not flinch. He did not take a single step back. He looked down at the woman he had married, his expression completely devoid of affection, pity, or hesitation. He looked at her with the cold, analytical detachment of a Supreme Court judge preparing to deliver a final, irreversible verdict. "I am a sworn officer of the court," Caroline Audrey stated, his deep voice carrying a lethal, unwavering calm that cut through her hysteria. And I am a man who built his entire life on a foundation of absolute integrity. I protect the truth. I do not protect thieves. I do not protect corporate frauds, and I absolutely do not protect a family of arrogant parasites who think their fabricated social status puts them above the law. Caroline gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck by his words. "We are your family!" she cried out, hot tears of manipulation spilling down her cheeks. "You married into the Blackwell legacy. You owe us your loyalty." Andre let out a sharp, disgusted laugh. The sound was utterly devoid of humor. "There is no Blackwell legacy, Caroline. There is only toxic debt, gross delusion, and an obscene sense of unearned entitlement. For 5 years, I compromised my own morals to keep the peace in your mother's house. I sat silently at dinner tables while she made subtle, racist microaggressions. I bit my tongue while your brother openly mocked working-class people. I told myself you were different from them. I desperately wanted to believe you were just a victim of your mother's manipulative influence." He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his broad shoulders squared, forcing Caroline to tilt her head up to meet his fierce, uncompromising gaze. "But you are not a victim," Andre declared, his voice rising just enough to command the absolute attention of the remaining guests. "You are an active, willing participant in their cruelty. When Eleanor tried to shove Audrey's hardworking parents to the kitchen doors tonight, you defended it. When Blake threw their handmade, irreplaceable family quilt in the garbage, you laughed about it. You are just as rotten, just as superficial, and just as morally bankrupt as the rest of your miserable lineage." Caroline opened her mouth to argue, to deploy another manipulative excuse, but no words came out. The sheer, undeniable truth of his assessment stripped away every single defense mechanism she possessed. She looked around the room, realizing that the powerful executives and socialites were watching her husband dismantle her character with nodding approval. Andre raised his left hand. He grabbed the thick gold wedding band resting on his ring finger. With one smooth, deliberate, and powerful motion, he pulled the ring off. He did not throw it in her face. He did not make a dramatic, emotional spectacle. He simply reached out and dropped the heavy gold band directly into Caroline's trembling, manicured palm. "I am done," Andre announced, his voice echoing with absolute, unyielding finality. "I am officially done shrinking my own character to fit into your toxic, pathetic world. I refuse to let your family's financial crimes and ethical depravity stain my professional reputation or my soul for one more second." Caroline stared down at the gold ring resting in her hand, her entire body shaking violently. "You cannot do this," she whispered, her voice breaking into a pathetic sob. "Andre, please. You are embarrassing me. We can go to counseling. We can fix this. My legal team will file the divorce papers on Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. Andre continued, completely ignoring her tears. "Do not call my personal phone. Do not show up at my law firm. All future communication will go exclusively through my attorneys. We have no shared assets. We have no children. And as of this exact second, we have absolutely no relationship." He turned his back on her, effectively and permanently erasing her from his existence. He walked straight toward my parents, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on my father's shoulder, checking on them with genuine protective care. Caroline stood entirely alone in the center of the massive ballroom. She looked at the empty, humiliated VIP table. She looked at the heavy gold ring in her hand. Completely broken, socially exiled, and stripped of her very last remaining shield of respectability, she turned and fled. She ran out of the grand double doors, her sobs echoing down the corridor as she disappeared into the night to join the ashes of her ruined family. I stood on the stage watching her exit. I felt a profound, overwhelming wave of respect for the man who had just reclaimed his freedom alongside me. Justice had not just been served financially and legally today, it had been executed morally. The toxic bonds that had threatened to suffocate both of us were permanently severed, leaving nothing behind but the clean, undeniable clarity of the truth. I placed the microphone onto the nearest speaker stand. The sharp thud echoed briefly, signaling the definitive end to the ugliest chapter of my life. I walked down the carpeted stairs of the stage. My custom silk gown glided smoothly over the marble floor. I did not look back at the exit where Blake and Eleanor had been dragged away. They were ghosts to me now, permanently erased from my financial and personal future. I walked straight down the center aisle, parting the sea of empty chairs left behind by the fleeing Blackwell relatives. My destination was the back corner of the ballroom. My parents, Henry and Martha, were standing exactly where I had left them. My mother was clutching my bridal bouquet so tightly, her knuckles were white. My father had his arm wrapped securely around her waist. They looked completely overwhelmed, processing the sheer magnitude of the storm I had just unleashed. I stopped in front of them. The adrenaline that had fueled my ruthless corporate execution began to ebb, replaced by a profound, overwhelming surge of love for the two people who had given me everything. Mom, Dad. I said, my voice softening entirely. I am so sorry you had to witness that. I am sorry you were ever subjected to their disrespect. My father shook his head. He stepped forward and wrapped his strong, calloused hands around my shoulders. He looked at me not with fear or confusion, but with absolute bursting pride. You have nothing to apologize for, Audrey? My father said, his voice thick with emotion. You stood your ground. You protected yourself. You fought like a lioness today, and I have never been prouder to be your father. My mother stepped forward and pulled me into a fierce embrace. The scent of her familiar floral perfume grounded me instantly. We raised a strong woman, she whispered against my cheek. Do not ever let anyone make you feel small. I pulled back and smiled at them. The tears I had refused to shed for Blake finally threatened to fall for my parents, but these were tears of absolute triumph. I reached out and took my father's rough hand in my left hand, and my mother's hand in my right. We are not standing by the kitchen doors anymore, I announced. Follow me. I led my parents away from the shadows and marched them straight down the center of the grand ballroom. The remaining guests, my Wall Street colleagues, my loyal friends, and the corporate partners who had stayed to watch the execution, parted like the Red Sea to let us through. They were watching us with deep, unadulterated respect. In a world driven by capital and power, they had just witnessed the ultimate display of loyalty and strength. I guided Henry and Martha directly to the main VIP table. The massive table covered in custom silk linens, towering white orchids, and gold-rimmed crystal. The table Eleanor had claimed was too sophisticated for Iowa farmers. Sit right here, I instructed, pulling out the two massive velvet-backed chairs at the absolute center of the table. The seats of honor. My parents hesitated for a fraction of a second, overwhelmed by the sheer opulence of the setting. But Audrey, who had followed us down the aisle, stepped forward with a warm, commanding smile. Take the seats, Mr. and Mrs. Lawson. Audrey urged, pulling out a chair for himself adjacent to my father. You earned them. And quite frankly, the company at this table has vastly improved in the last 10 minutes. My parents smiled and took their seats at the center of the room. I sat down right next to them. Audrey took his place beside us, a true protector and a brilliant man who had just sacrificed his own toxic marriage to stand on the right side of history. We were a formidable bonded unit. I looked out at the room. About 100 guests remained. These were the titans of industry, my close personal friends and the executives who understood the value of true integrity. They were standing near their tables, watching me, waiting for my cue. I caught the eye of the general manager, who was hovering near the catering doors with his army of waitstaff. He looked incredibly anxious, unsure if the massive $500,000 reception was being canceled entirely. I raised my hand and gestured for him to approach. He hurried over to the main table, standing at strict attention. Mom, the manager said, bowing his head respectfully. How would you like us to proceed? Should we begin clearing the venue? I looked at the manager, then out at the crowd. I stood up from my velvet chair. I grabbed a fresh crystal flute from the table and held it up high in the air. Absolutely not. I projected my voice so it carried clearly across the quiet ballroom. I paid for a 5-star dinner service, and we are going to enjoy every single bite of it. I turned to address the crowd directly. To my friends, my colleagues, and the partners who stayed, I said, a genuine, radiant smile finally breaking across my face. The wedding has been officially canceled. But I refused to let a spectacular venue, a world-class menu, and a fully stocked open bar go to waste. A ripple of laughter and cheering erupted from the Wall Street crowd. I looked back at the general manager. "Bring out the vintage champagne," I ordered. "Bring out the reserve bottles, the ones Eleanor tried to hoard for her fake socialite friends. Pour it for everyone in this room. Bring out the caviar. Start the dinner service. Tell the band to get back on that stage and play something upbeat." The manager smiled widely, visibly relieved. "Right away, Ms. Lawson." I raised my glass higher. The remaining guests immediately grabbed their own glasses and raised them in unison. To the people who actually matter, I toasted, looking down at my parents, then over at Audrey, and finally out at the crowd of loyal friends. To cutting toxic assets from our portfolios and our lives. And to the truth, no matter how much it costs to expose it. The wedding is dead, but the party celebrating my absolute freedom officially begins right now. The ballroom exploded into thunderous, joyous applause. The band, taking my command, literally immediately launched into a high-energy, triumphant jazz number. The heavy, oppressive tension that had choked the room just 20 minutes ago completely evaporated, replaced by a vibrant, electric atmosphere of celebration. Waiters in crisp white jackets flooded through the kitchen doors carrying silver trays loaded with top-tier champagne and gourmet appetizers. They swarmed our table, prioritizing my parents with the utmost respect and care. I watched my father take a sip of the vintage champagne, his eyes widening in appreciation. I watched my mother laugh as Audrey leaned over and told her a joke, his deep, resonant laughter joining hers. My hedge fund partners began walking over to the main table. They did not come to offer pity. They came to offer congratulations. The managing director of a rival firm shook my hand firmly, telling me it was the greatest display of corporate and personal defense he had ever witnessed. My friends pulled up chairs, expanding our circle, filling the empty seats with genuine love and loud, authentic joy. The food was exquisite, the music was perfect, the company was flawless. I sat back in my chair, looking at the beautiful, chaotic, joyous celebration unfolding around me. I had lost a fiancé today. I had lost a toxic, indebted mother-in-law. But looking at the smiling faces of the Iowa farmers who raised me, and the brilliant lawyer who had stood by my side, I knew I had not actually lost anything of value. I had gained the world. I was 30 years old, completely unburdened, wildly successful, and entirely free. The food tasted richer, the air felt lighter, and for the first time in a very long time, the future looked absolutely limitless. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air of New York City felt sharper and cleaner than it ever had before. The fallout from that spectacular wedding reception was a masterclass in swift, merciless justice. The financial and legal mechanisms I had set in motion that night operated with the exact lethal precision of a perfectly calibrated trading algorithm. I had promised the Blackwell family absolute destruction, and the universe delivered it with a breathtaking level of efficiency. True to my word, at exactly 9 o'clock the Monday morning following the canceled wedding, my legal team filed the official eviction and foreclosure papers. Eleanor desperately tried to fight it. She frantically called her former high society connections, begging for a bridge loan, a legal favor, or even just a temporary place to stay. But in the ruthless ecosystem of the elite, bankruptcy is highly contagious. Nobody answered her calls. Her number was blocked across the entire upper echelon of the city. The sheriff's department arrived at her sprawling suburban estate exactly 48 hours later. It was a crisp, clear morning, meaning every single one of her wealthy neighbors was outside to witness the spectacle. The grand matriarch of the fabricated Blackwell empire was physically escorted off the property she no longer owned. She was forced to drag 2 cheap nylon duffel bags containing whatever off-rack clothing the repo men had not already seized to satisfy her other massive outstanding debts. Her luxury leased vehicles had been towed the night before. The sprawling estate, the physical manifestation of her arrogant delusions, was officially my legal property. I did not keep it. I had absolutely no desire to maintain a monument to her vanity and financial incompetence. My holding company placed the property on the market, immediately pricing it aggressively for a rapid cash sale. It sold in less than 14 days to a young tech executive who immediately brought in contractors to gut Eleanor's outdated, pretentious renovations. The sale of the estate generated a massive influx of liquid capital, but keeping that money in my personal portfolio felt like holding on to contaminated assets. I wanted to transform their toxic, arrogant legacy into something undeniably pure and powerful. I wired the entire net proceeds of the sale into a newly formed, highly protected trust. I established the Iowa Heart Foundation. It was a comprehensive, fully funded scholarship program designed exclusively for first-generation college students from rural farming communities across the Midwest. I wanted to find the kids who woke up before dawn, who worked with their hands in the dirt, and who possessed the exact same grit work ethic and unbreakable integrity as my parents. The foundation provided full university tuition housing and generous living stipends to ensure these students never had to worry about predatory loans or elitist judgment. I named Henry and Martha as the honorary co-chairs of the board of directors. Watching my father cut the ribbon at the foundation's inaugural charity gala in Manhattan, wearing a perfectly tailored suit that he actually felt comfortable in, was the greatest return on investment I had ever achieved. My mother stood beside him, glowing with genuine pride, surrounded by Wall Street executives who treated them both with the utmost respect. The money that Eleanor had desperately hoarded to project a fake image of superiority was now paying for the education of the exact demographic she had called poor and country trash. It was the ultimate poetic financial justice. As for Blake, the justice system moved with a heavy, crushing finality. Federal authorities do not look kindly upon corporate wire fraud, especially when the digital footprint and IP logs are handed to them on a silver platter by a top-tier corporate litigator. Audrey's meticulous legal referrals triggered a massive multi-agency investigation by the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The corporate embezzlement charges from his former investment firm were just the tip of the iceberg. Investigators uncovered a web of illegal offshore betting accounts and tax evasion schemes Blake had been running for years. Faced with a mountain of undeniable digital evidence and the prospect of a brutal, highly publicized trial, Blake crumbled. He accepted a global plea deal. I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom with Audrey acting as my legal counsel and watched the judge hand down the sentence. Blake was sentenced to 48 months in a federal penitentiary, followed by 5 years of supervised release and court-ordered financial restitution. The man who had sneered at my parents from a $500,000 VIP table, the man who was so terrified of looking poor in front of his boss, was now wearing a standard-issue khaki prison uniform. He cried when the bailiff placed him in handcuffs. He looked back at me from the defense table, mouthing a pathetic, silent apology. I did not blink. I simply stared at him with the cold, detached expression of a woman who had successfully liquidated a terrible investment. His entire identity, built entirely on designer labels, and borrowed wealth, was stripped away completely. He was earning pennies an hour in the prison laundry facility, entirely forgotten by the corporate world he worshipped. The remaining Blackwell family faced absolute, unmitigated social exile. Without Blake's corporate salary to leech off of, and without the illusion of her grand estate, Eleanor's bankruptcy was finalized in court. She was forced to move into a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment in a neighborhood she would have previously refused to even drive through. She took a minimum wage job working the register at a discount retail store just to survive. Her former friends actively crossed the street when they saw her walking to the bus stop. She was a ghost in her own city, a cautionary tale whispered about at the very country clubs she once tried to rule. She had pushed my family to the back by the kitchen doors, and karma had permanently relocated her to the bottom of the social food chain. Far away from the suffocating vanity of the East Coast elite, the late afternoon sun cast a brilliant golden glow over the sprawling acres of my parents' farm in Iowa. This was my sanctuary. There were no imported white orchids here, no gold-rimmed crystal chargers, and absolutely no assigned seating to segregate people by their net worth. There was only the honest, grounding scent of sweet corn, the distant hum of a harvester, and the rich, mouth-watering aroma of thick-cut ribeye steaks sizzling over an open charcoal grill. I stood on the back porch wearing a pair of faded denim jeans and a simple cotton shirt. My feet were clad in scuffed boots. I was completely devoid of designer labels, heavy makeup, or the rigid armor I wore on Wall Street. I was just Audrey, the real Audrey, the woman Blake and Eleanor had been so desperately ashamed of. I took a deep breath of the clean country air, holding an ice-cold beer in my hand, watching my father expertly flip the steaks, while my mother arranged a massive bowl of fresh potato salad on our sturdy wooden picnic table. The familiar crunch of heavy tires rolling over the long gravel driveway caught our attention. I turned to see a sleek, polished black SUV pull up near the barn. The driver's side door opened and Andre stepped out into the Iowa sunset. He looked entirely different from the tense, suffocated man I had known during my engagement. He was no longer carrying the suffocating weight of Caroline's toxic entitlement. He wore a crisp, casual linen shirt and dark jeans, trading his rigid corporate courtroom armor for relaxed comfort. But he still moved with that same undeniable, powerful presence. Since the wedding incident, Andre's career had skyrocketed. Severing ties with the Blackwell family had been the smartest personal and professional move of his life. He was now a senior managing partner at one of the most prestigious law firms in the country. He handled my hedge fund's most complex legal acquisitions, but more importantly, he had become the fierce, protective older brother I never had by blood, but had absolutely earned by choice. Henry Andre called out, his deep, resonant voice carrying across the yard. He walked straight toward the grill, a wide, genuine smile breaking across his handsome face. "I hope you saved the thickest cut for me. I brought that bourbon from Kentucky I promised you." My father chuckled, stepping away from the smoke to grip Andre's hand in a firm, calloused handshake before pulling the towering lawyer into a warm, familiar embrace. "You know your seat is always reserved at this table, son," my father replied, his eyes crinkling with absolute joy. Martha rushed over, wiping her hands on her apron, and hugged Andre tightly. She did not see a high-powered attorney or a former connection to a nightmare. She simply saw family. Andre handed her a beautifully wrapped bottle of artisanal honey he had picked up during his travels, remembering her love for baking. Then he turned to me. We locked eyes, sharing a silent, profound understanding that only two people who had survived the exact same war could comprehend. "Look at the ruthless titan of Wall Street," Andre teased, gesturing to my worn-out boots and messy ponytail. "If your rivals could see you now, they would be terrified." I laughed, a bright, unburdened sound that came from the very bottom of my chest. "They should be terrified," I shot back, clinking my beer bottle against his. "I just closed a massive merger this morning while sitting on the porch swing. Turns out you do not need Italian marble countertops to generate capital. You just need a strong internet connection and zero dead weight holding you down." We walked over to the picnic table together, taking our seats as the sun dipped lower, painting the expansive Midwestern sky in breathtaking shades of vibrant orange and deep purple. There was no head of the table here. There were no VIP sections. We sat shoulder to shoulder, passing plates of homemade food, sharing loud, unfiltered stories, and laughing until our sides physically ached. Looking around at the three people sitting with me, I realized the ultimate truth about human connection. The Blackwells had been obsessed with maintaining an aesthetic of lineage and exclusivity, believing that a shared last name entitled them to abuse and exploit anyone they deemed inferior. But family is not an automatic right granted by a birth certificate or a marriage license. Family is an active daily choice. Family consists of the people who pull up a chair for you when you are exhausted. They are the ones who do not demand you shrink your ambition to accommodate their fragile egos. Andre was not bound to me by any legal document anymore. His divorce from Caroline was finalized months ago with ruthless efficiency. Yet here he was, flying halfway across the country just to share a meal on a farm in Iowa because we had chosen each other. We had forged an unbreakable bond in the fires of absolute truth and mutual respect. I watched my mother serve Andre an extra portion of brisket, treating him with the exact same maternal devotion she showed me. I watched my father ask him for advice on a tractor investment, genuinely valuing Andre's brilliant analytical mind. This was my real empire. The billions of dollars I managed for my clients gave me power, but this wooden table gave me absolute peace. I had systematically destroyed the people who tried to bury me, and in the process, I had cleared the ground to cultivate a life of profound, untouchable happiness. The air was cool, the food was perfect, and the laughter was real. I took another sip of my drink, leaning back against the wooden bench, completely surrounded by the family I had fought for, the family I had protected, and the family I had deliberately, fiercely chosen. As the stars began to pierce the twilight canopy above the farm, I closed my eyes and let the profound stillness wash over me. If this entire ordeal has taught me anything, it is the absolute non-negotiable power of financial independence. Money did not buy my happiness today, but it purchased my armor. It gave me the leverage to sever toxic ties without a single second of hesitation, and the freedom to walk away from a family that viewed my bank account as their personal bailout fund and my background as a punchline. For too long, I allowed people wrapped in fake designer clothes and drowning in secret debt to make me feel inadequate. I almost let their arrogant, empty noise drown out my own truth. But I learned a vital lesson, one I will carry into every boardroom and every relationship for the rest of my life. Never let people who have absolutely nothing define your value simply because they have a louder mouth. Your worth is built on your integrity, your work ethic, and the people you choose to stand beside you when the fire gets hot. I built my empire from the ground up, and tonight, looking at the genuine smiles of my real family, I know that my foundation is finally permanently unbreakable. If my journey resonated with you, please share your own experiences of standing up to toxic entitlement in the comments below. And do not forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more stories of claiming your absolute true worth.